At the end of a symphony, in the final movement, all the melodies, all the notes, all the musical motifs the composer has used all often come back, and sort of like all the loose ends get tied back up in this big final musical finale. It happens over and over and over again in the great symphonies and classical music. And in an important way, something similar happens at the death of Jesus in Mark chapter 15. All these themes, all these big ideas, all these recurring melodies almost, all come together at the cross of Jesus. That's where we're looking today on Meeting Jesus. So we are almost to the end of Mark's gospel, and we are at this climactic moment that either looks like the terrible tragedy of the death of Jesus, the Son of God, or, as Mark has been telling us, it's actually the upside-down victory, the surprising way that God saves and redeems the world. We said last time the empire had a way of looking at crucifixion, especially crucifixion of Jesus, and saying, look, this proves that we're the winners. We crush them. We destroy our enemies. That's how you know that we're the winners. And Jesus has been all throughout the gospel offering a different reading, saying, no, I've come not to be served, but to serve. I've come to lay down my life like a ransom. This is my way of saving. This is the way God's reign comes, not by conquering his enemies, but by dying at the hands of his enemies, so that, yes, there's resurrection word to be spoken in due time. But the cross itself is good news in this surprising upside-down kind of way. And so here, as we get to the end of chapter 15, a number of really, really important themes come back. We got about halfway through chapter 15 in our last session, and today we're going to take a look beginning in verse 33 and following. Jesus has been on the cross for several hours now, and the land turns completely dark. And at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Jesus cries out with a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani. This is the Aramaic of the opening line of Psalm 22. My God, why have you forsaken me? And to be sure, this is a moment of utter dereliction, of Jesus feeling utterly abandoned. And as we saw a chapter ago, Jesus in the garden doesn't want to have to go through this. So even though we will have a way of talking about the cross as God's surprising, unexpected victory, this is not fun. This is not something that's enjoyable to go through. And Jesus feels utter abandonment. Now, we might end up needing to say, the choice that Jesus makes, the choice that God makes at the cross, is that God is willing to bear God-forsakenness in order not to abandon the rest of humanity, in order not to abandon the world, that God in Jesus is willing to be God-forsaken. At this point, our words almost fall apart, but something like that is going on here, that when Jesus cries out feeling God-forsaken, quoting Psalm 22, there's a real sense of abandonment, and yet we've seen all along that Jesus sort of embodies the very presence of God. He says and does things that only God's allowed to do in the Gospels. And there's some sense in which God chooses to take on that kind of abandonment. Not that God is foisting it on Jesus, but that God in Jesus takes on that sense of God-forsakenness in order to not abandon the rest of the world that God loves. At the same time, it's worth noting when other people around listen to Jesus crying out, Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani, they hear it as calling out for Elijah, whose name sounds an awful lot like Eloi in Aramaic. Oh, he's calling for Elijah. This guy, this poor delusional guy, he's dying, he's hallucinating, he's crying out for Elijah. And some people think, let's just put him out of his misery. And other people think, let's see if Elijah comes, right? Is this the moment when at the last second, God swoops in, Deus ex machina style, and brings the prophet Elijah along to swoop Jesus away so he doesn't have to actually die? At this point, there's sort of that last desperate hope is finally removed, right? By the end of the story, it's clear nobody prevents Jesus from dying. There's no last-minute dramatic rescue that prevents Jesus from going all the way into death. Jesus goes all the way into death. Jesus dies. That's important because we may have said before in our conversations around the table that so often I think what we would prefer is a heroic kind of Jesus who looks like he's in danger, but at the last second it turns out, he was bulletproof all along. It turns out he was invincible. But that Jesus actually really dies. That's significant. That there is no distance, no length to which Jesus will not go for us. It's not that Jesus says, well, I'll risk my life as long as I know that in the nick of the time I'll be fine. But that Jesus knows all the way to the point of death, and then he actually dies. Now, when that happens, two really, really interesting, important things happen, as Mark tells it. And again, this is sort of those big themes of Mark's gospel, all coming together like in the final movement of a symphony. One is, Mark says, the curtain of the temple is torn in two from top to bottom. That word torn is the same word that Mark had used when Jesus was baptized, and the heavens are torn open, right? And there's this sort of symbolic sense that whatever the boundary is, whatever the separation is between God and humanity, it's pulled apart in Jesus. Whether there's something that our sin has separated us from God, or just God's divine distance and holiness and otherness and our human createdness, whatever that distance is, whatever that separation, that boundary is, in Jesus, that boundary has been pulled open, torn open, to borrow Mark's wording. For it begins at Jesus' baptism when the heavens are torn open and God speaks, and there Jesus embodies God with us. But it's there also at the cross when the temple curtain, which sort of symbolizes the boundary between God's presence in the holiest place in the temple and the rest of the profane world, that curtain in the temple is torn apart at the moment of Jesus' death. This is Mark doing one of those show, don't tell kind of moments, doing theology and saying, at the death of Jesus, whatever that boundary is, whatever that separation, whatever that distance is between God and humanity, God has ended it and torn apart the boundary from God's side to ours, from top to bottom, so to speak. Throughout the New Testament, there's this recurring imagery that there's some kind of boundary that God has torn apart through the cross and resurrection of Jesus. It's all over, say, the letter to the Ephesians. It talks about God having pulled down the dividing wall, about God having ended the hostility that was between us and God and us and one another. So here's Mark saying that happens at the death of Jesus, echoing the way he set up that theme all the way back in the first chapter when Jesus is baptized and the heavens themselves are torn open. So that thread comes here to the very end. And then another interesting detail, once Jesus dies, once he breathes his last and the temple curtain is torn, Mark says this. Now when the centurion, this is the guy responsible for the crucifixion, the execution of Jesus, when the centurion who stood facing him saw that in this way he breathed his last, he said, truly, this man was God's son. Now, I don't know exactly what a centurion thinks he means when he says something like that, right? If you're a Roman centurion, you may well have grown up in a pantheon of all sorts of Roman and Greek deities and gods and goddesses. It may not quite land with the heft that it does when we Christians, knowing the creed, say that Jesus is God's son. But clearly, he has a sense of this is divine. This one who died here, this is God's presence. This is the divine has come close. It's significant because all throughout Mark's gospel, we've been watching this tension. Who are the people who recognize who Jesus is and who are the people who just don't get it? And how Mark has kind of highlighted the unexpectedness, right? The people who get it, who recognize who Jesus is. Well, okay, God, the voice from heaven, Mark, the narrator, but then a whole bunch of unlikely people. The demons and evil spirits recognize Jesus. The blind people recognize Jesus when he heals and they cry out, Son of David, right? They get it, who Jesus is. And then the people who don't get it, the respectable religious people, look at Jesus, listen to Jesus and go, well, this guy must be in league with the devil, or this guy is crazy, or this guy's out of his mind, this guy can't be the Son of God. And then in between are Jesus' disciples who have some moments when they blurt out, you're the Messiah, and other moments when they watch Jesus do something amazing and they're left scratching their heads going, who is this guy? In other words, all along, the unlikely people, the nobodies, the not good enoughs, the not smart enoughs, those are the ones who get it, who really see Jesus. The respectable religious people who are educated and trained and should know to recognize a Messiah when they see one are the ones who persistently miss it. And finally, the last person in Mark's gospel to recognize who Jesus is the Roman centurion, who is not just an outsider, although definitely that, he's a Gentile. He's a military officer in the enemy occupying army, right? The empire's army. He's the one responsible for crucifying Jesus, and he sees Jesus has been the Son of God. This is how God operates. In Mark's gospel, and Mark would have us believe in the world, that God is always showing up and being revealed among the least expected, the nobodies, the unintelligent, the uneducated, the not powerful, not prestigious, the ones who aren't supposed to be enlightened, the outsiders and strangers and foreigners, and not the insiders and the elites. This is how God operates. This is how God's reign comes. Again, it's one of those important themes that we've been seeing all throughout Mark's gospel, all finally coming together now in this final climactic moment. Then finally, we get to the burial of Jesus. When evening comes on that day, since it was the day of preparation for the Sabbath, they want to move ahead with getting Jesus buried so they don't have to break the Sabbath rule. Interesting how often in Mark's gospel, one of the controversies the people have been bringing to Jesus is whether he would heal people on the Sabbath day, whether that was allowed or not. And here we have this concern about we have to rest on the Sabbath. So yeah, Jesus' body will rest on the Sabbath. It will be in a borrowed tomb. They end up getting a tomb to borrow, and someone who's sort of a secret follower of Jesus, Joseph of Arimathea, asks for the body of Jesus, gets it from Pontius Pilate. Pilate is kind of surprised that Jesus is already dead, but gets the body, gives it to him. And then here are some important details to note. Joseph bought a linen cloth, and taking down the body, wrapped it in the linen cloth and laid it in a tomb that had been hewn in the rock. He then rolled a stone against the door of the tomb. Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Joseph, saw where the body was laid. In other words, so far, we've seen a lot of tying up of loose ends, right? We've seen a bunch of themes of Mark's gospel all getting brought back together for one final sort of, all tied up. Almost like the season finale of a TV show, right? Where all the plot lines you've been watching all season long all sort of get tied up. And then there's the stinger. There's that sort of like, a new thread that proposes there's something more to be said coming up in a next season. Because Mark says, after Joseph wraps Jesus' body in linen cloths and puts it in the tomb, rolls the stone from the tomb, he says explicitly, Mary Magdalene and Mary, mother of Joseph, sees the tomb. They know the location because the very next scene, as we get next week into Mark chapter 16, is going to be women going to the tomb, expecting that they will find Jesus' body so that they can complete the funeral ritual. They can anoint his body and prepare it for final burial. And Mark is already laying the groundwork to say they know where they're going. There is no possibility that they get lost. There's no possibility that they don't know where they are. They go to the wrong tomb. They know, they've seen it, they know exactly where to go. Jesus' body is in the grave the last time they see it. And it's just sort of left hanging there because you and I know, spoiler alert, when they get to the tomb, Jesus' body won't be there. Mark is setting the table for the great resurrection miracle, for the great wonder of the empty tomb and why it's good news. But he's got to set the table for that. Almost like when a magician does like a disappearing person trick, they'll put the lady goes in the box, they'll close up the box, and we're all clear in the audience, right? Where's the lady? She's in the box. So then when he opens the door and the lady's missing, something amazing has happened, right? We're getting the table set for that. So here's Mark doing what a good showman does, so to speak, saying, Jesus' body goes in the tomb. They close the tomb. There's no back doors. The women see the tomb, right? This is where Jesus' body is. And when we get to Sunday morning and there is a surprise, Mark has been preparing us for that possibility. That's going to be important because the way Mark tells us the story of Jesus' resurrection is surprising, and I would dare say almost absurd in its surprising plot twist kind of move. But here's Mark preparing us. The last anybody saw the body of Jesus, it was there in the tomb. So, in this last chapter, in this last section of chapter 15, rather, we see a bunch of important ideas and themes all come together, and it feels like they're getting all resolved, right? The who recognizes Jesus, the Jesus breaking down the barrier between us and God. All these themes sort of come together, and then there's this, but there's a new season starting. There will be another episode. There will be more story to tell, and I'm just letting you know, the women saw the tomb where the body was laid, and it just sort of hangs there. And that's where we're headed next time. We hope you'll join us for one more conversation here in our series, Meeting Jesus, and that you'll continue to get to know Jesus through the Gospel of Mark, as well as in our whole lives as Christians. See you next time.